Hi guys, and welcome to the second lecture for Chapter 7. Today we're going to dive into an introduction into agriculture as well as sustainable farming. So let's check it out. So it's probably useful to give a concrete definition for what agriculture actually is. We hear the word all the time and we have a general idea of what it means, but a hard definition is often very useful. So agriculture is the practice of raising crops and livestock for human use and consumption. And within agriculture, we're going to differentiate between two different types of farmland. Cropland is basically the land that we use to raise plants, and rangeland is the land that we use for grazing for livestock, which we then consume. Now, recall back in Chapter 6 how our populations are expanding, and historically we've always produced more food than is required to feed the population. We have always made sure that production in agriculture has outpaced human growth and the needs associated with continued population growth. And when we look at agriculture, there are two basic ways to increase food production. The first is extensification, and the second is intensification. We focused on extensification primarily through human history, but more recently, since around the 1900s and the advent of the Industrial and then Green Revolutions, we then focused on intensification. Now, extensification is defined as an increase in the total amount of farmland, that is, cropland, to increase our yields. So when we talk about extensification, we are literally just expanding the total amount of farmland that we are using to generate food. More land here directly equates to more food. However, in intensification, this is defined as an increase in the agricultural production per unit area. And what this directly translates into is that in intensification, we are trying to increase the amount of food a given amount or area of land can actually produce. So in contrast to extensification, intensification, we keep the amount of land we are using for farmland constant, and we are increasing our inputs into that land to get more bang for our buck. Increases in the inputs into that land can be things like labor, so we are working harder to get that land to produce more food. We are adding time, so we're spending more time trying to grow food in that area. We are adding inputs such as fertilizer, things like nitrogen and phosphorus, to bolster that soil's capacity to produce more food, as well as using more seed, etc. Anytime we are increasing the inputs per unit land to keep the amount of land constant and increase our yields in agriculture, that is going to be intensification. Whenever we are just simply increasing the amount of land that we have to grow more food, that is extensification. Now, I want you to keep extensification and intensification in mind when we differentiate between what we call traditional agriculture and what we're going to define as industrial agriculture. Traditional agriculture, I want you to think of as the agriculture we practiced for thousands and thousands of years before we entered the Industrial Revolution. In traditional agriculture, crops were cultivating primarily using human labor, animals, and simple tools. The soil that they had was more or less the soil that they were going to get. However many nutrients were in that soil is basically going to determine the output or the amount of yields that you were going to get per unit area of land. So what I'm trying to say is that if they wanted to grow more food, they needed more land to grow it on, and they primarily relied on extensification to increase their food yield. However, all of that changed once we entered the Industrial Revolution in the mid-1800s, and this is when we began to dive into industrial agriculture. In industrial agriculture, a lot of the inputs that were traditionally going to be pretty simple, such as human labor, animal labor, and simple tools, those are all going to be replaced with modern machinery and different processes that allowed us to increase the inputs into a given land. So, for example, large-scale mechanization using tractors, for example, and fossil fuel combustion began to replace animals such as horses and oxen. So now we no longer had to rely on human labor or animal labor to get things done. Now we could rely on large-scale mechanization. In addition, we also used chemicals to boost the yields of our farmland. For the most readily available example is going to be synthetic fertilizers. No longer did we have to rely on the natural fertility of the soil to give us nice agricultural yields. Now, with the advent of something called the Haber-Bosch process, which we're not really going to go into, we could actually generate our own readily available nitrogen and phosphorus, those foods that plants need, in order to dramatically increase the yields that a given amount of land could provide. In addition, we also invented pesticides, basically chemical toxins, in order to boost plant survival by basically keeping them from being eaten by insects. So now not only could we get our land to produce more food, we could keep that food from being eaten by other means, and we could retain that food so we could boost our food production. So now with the advent of industrial agriculture, we could suddenly dramatically increase the inputs that we put into any given unit of land. Those inputs again are going to be additional energy in the form of fossil fuels and additional energy in the form of mechanization such as tractors. In addition, we could also input chemicals such as fertilizers and pesticides, all of which dramatically increase the yields a given parcel or area of land could actually produce. So suddenly, a given amount of land could produce way more food way faster than ever before, and we no longer needed to increase the amount of land we were working with just to increase our yields. All of a sudden, we could just increase the inputs that we put into a given amount of land to increase our yields, and it dramatically reduced the amount of area needed to feed a given amount of population. Now, this is largely reflective in global trends since the Industrial Revolution. Food production has tripled over the last 100 years, but the actual amount of land we needed in order to triple production has only actually increased by about 30%. So we are dramatically intensifying our agriculture, but we are not extensifying our agriculture since the Industrial Revolution. Now, the effects of industrialized agriculture are a bit of a mixed bag. On the bright side of things, the dramatic gains associated with industrialized agriculture have allowed food production to keep pace with exploding population growth, particularly exploding population growth since the 1900s, and I'll have you refer back to some of the lectures in Chapter 6 for when exactly our populations exploded. And in essence, the gains in yield associated with industrialized agriculture have allowed us to avoid mass starvation by keeping food production ahead of the needs associated with increased population growth. In addition to this, increases in yields associated with industrialized agriculture have been primarily from intensification instead of extensification. Because of this, we have reduced the need to convert additional natural ecosystems into farmland. We don't necessarily need to go out and convert as much natural land into farmland because we can simply increase the inputs into the land we already have to bolster our yields. So there are a few bright sides associated with industrial agriculture. However, there are several drawbacks associated with industrial agriculture as well. Remember that in industrial agriculture, because we are relying on intensification, we are increasing the inputs to a given amount of land. However, when we increase inputs to an amount of land, any amount of land, we are dramatically increasing our resource consumption. So when we are increasing our irrigation, we are using more water. When we are increasing the energy we put into a given amount of land, we are increasing fossil fuel use. When we are increasing fertilizer we put into soils, we are increasing the nitrogen and phosphorus that we are releasing into the ecosystem and into the ambient environment. And in addition, high pesticide use both draws resources to synthesize those pesticides, but it also causes us to release a lot of pollutants into the natural environment. So on the bright side, industrial agriculture generally has allowed us to keep our food production on pace with the needs associated with growing populations, and we can do this without using as much land as we otherwise would. However, on the downsides, the results of intensification associated with industrialized agriculture have dramatically increased things like resource consumption, pollution, as well as erosion. So we're in a bit of a conundrum, aren't we? If we rely on the current model, which is industrial agriculture, we rely primarily on intensification. So we are using less land, but more inputs, and that results in increases in resource consumption, increases in pollution, and increases in erosion. And that erosion term is new. It's something related to soils, and that's something that we'll talk about in the near future. But if we forgo the industrial model entirely and revert back to traditional agriculture, that model relies primarily on extensification. So now we are no longer using as many resources, and we are no longer polluting or contributing to erosion. However, we are using way more land, and that results in habitat loss. So either model has a bunch of problems associated with it, and that that brings us to sustainable agriculture. Sustainable agriculture describes agriculture and an agricultural model that tries to maintain healthy soil, clean water, pollinators, and genetic diversity, all of which are associated and essential to long-term crop and livestock production. And sustainable agriculture does all of these things by essentially trying to treat agricultural systems as ecosystems. And what that means is that sustainable agriculture tries to mimic natural ecosystems and the way that those natural ecosystems would actually operate. So sustainable agriculture tries to operate with those nutrient cycles that we talked about way back in chapter 2 in mind. And in doing so, managers of sustainable agricultural farms try to internally stabilize their agriculture with negative feedback loops that will return a system back to normal if it has been knocked off balance. Now, in addition, these agricultural systems are often integrated with the natural environment. So not only are they minimizing the effects on the natural environment, but they are actually trying to become a part of the natural environment so as to minimize habitat loss associated with increased extensification of agricultural units. And so by doing all of these things and implementing all of these different procedures, sustainable agriculture both reduces environmental impacts from food production and it minimizes the habitat loss associated with continuing to convert more natural ecosystems into farmland. Now that's one basic and very broad synopsis of what sustainable agriculture is, and we're going to talk more about sustainable agriculture in the last lecture in chapter 7. However, that is everything I have for you guys today. Next, we'll be diving deep into soils as well as some of the problems associated with soils, and then we're going to return back to this topic of sustainable agriculture and how it can remediate all of the problems that we have associated with farmland and agriculture in a nutshell. All right, I'll see you guys next time for a lecture on soils.